Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen, and with us for our program today, Assemblyman Will Barclay. Will Barclay represents the 124th Assembly District in New York State, an Assembly District that includes the counties of Oswego and Onondaga. We want to thank you folks all throughout the region for joining us for our program today. And Will Barclay, thanks for being here. Nice to see you.
Good to be here, Mike. Nice seeing you.
We got lots to get caught up on.
We have.
We are taping this program in what's, I guess you could call budget week at the state capitol. By the end of the week, as we tape this program, a budget's got to be in place. So there's all that hubbub and activity and conversation going on up and down the hallways of the Capitol. Plus, since the last time you were here, legislative day almost of historic importance and significance. You guys took up like every important piece of legislation under the sun.
Yeah, it was really something, Mike. I mean, what's incredible about this place is we start in January, as you know, and it's like a trickle. Nothing seems to happen, not much activity. And then when deadlines start coming up, and we were pressed against the redistricting deadlines, it's amazing how fast this place can
the floodgates open
at some point, right? But yeah, it was a very productive night. I mean, it was unfortunate that it was an all-night affair in the legislature. That goes back to the old days of dysfunction that we have in the state legislature. But at the same time, I was happy with a lot of stuff that got passed, so it wasn't all bad, I suppose.
Yeah, and even just to see the significant pieces of legislation that have been some of them talked about for years here at the state capitol, and one in particular, talked about for decades, the idea of having casino gaming in New York State. Geez, that goes back to Governor Mario Cuomo, and even before him.
Right.
So some, I hear exactly what you're saying. It's good to see that some of these issues have finally come to the floor of the Assembly and the Senate for votes. But boy, that was a busy night, and the rules were circumvented maybe just a little bit to get those bills so quickly onto the floor.
I mean, you wish we had a full debate. I always say on any legislation, I wish we had public hearing on legislation. You know, that would be a novel idea that other states do quite effectively.
Novel idea.
Yeah. But unfortunately, that wasn't to be. But you're right. I mean, the worst thing we do is legislature, which we've done in the past, who doesn't act on anything. I mean, at least we're acting, and to the credit to the governor, he's provided some leadership on some of these issues. Casino gambling was one you brought up, and you're right. In New York State, under the Constitution, unless you amend the Constitution, you can't have gambling in New York State. The governor talked about it in his State of the State address of wanting to expand gambling. He claims we already have gambling in New York State, so why are we handcuffing ourselves and not providing more when states around us are. I guess Pennsylvania now has expanded gambling very substantially. I actually voted against that. This would be amending the Constitution to allow 7 casinos in New York State. But it was really very broad legislation. One, it didn't set forth where the casinos were going to be, which I find highly problematic. And secondly, it didn't
all be in Oswego.
That wouldn't be a bad. I might even support it if it was all in Oswego. But my concern is
Trump North. That kind of thing.
I mean, there have been, interesting enough, there have been racinos proposed to be in Oswego because of its locale between Syracuse and Canada. They thought, there's some potential there, but nevertheless, that was there was no local control over this. So the state wants to say a developer wants to open a casino somewhere, the locals wouldn't have any control. It would be trumped by the state. So those are 2 reasons I voted against it. The other concern I have, and I mentioned this when the governor started talking about this in the State of the State, is I don't think we really should be looking at solving our fiscal problems in the state through gambling. I mean, there's a lot of problems.
That's got to be the attractive part of it, is that the legislature, and New York has been known to be a free spending legislature, looks at casinos and sees dollar signs. Right.
And in the past, on constitutional amendments, they've suggested where revenue from casinos need to go when they've done it in the past. And usually some of it's to gambling problems, to provide assistance to someone who's obviously a gambling problem. This one, it didn't indicate anywhere where the revenue was going to go other than into the state's general fund. But I think ideologically, whatever, I have some problem looking at it from that viewpoint, because I just think it's a sin. Clearly, it's one of those, sins, and should we be doing this to try to raise revenue, encouraging that to raise revenue for the state, I think it's somewhat problematic.
You mentioned the governor and his leadership in getting a lot of these bills kind of foisted onto the legislature. There was a little bit of horse trading going on. To set up the situation, what happened was the legislature needed to have its redistricted lines in place and approved by a deadline of a week or so ago. And for that to happen, the governor also needs to sign that legislation. The governor said, "Oh yeah, Sure, I'll sign those lines for you. No problem at all, as long as you do the casino legislation and a lot of these other things. We'll try to get through as much of it as we can here in the next 15 minutes.
Yeah, well, that was certainly the hammer the governor held, was the redistricting. If we didn't pass something for the state legislative lines, presumably the court would have taken it over and drawn their own lines. So this is a way the leader said, oh my goodness, we don't want to lose control of this redistricting. We think we're close to a deal with the governor. Let's do some of the things that he's looking for us to act upon, and while he'll sign redistricting for us. So redistricting, obviously controversial. I've been advocating for an independent redistricting commission since I've gotten in the Assembly. That was not to be, unfortunately, this year, but we did set up a framework to provide, to again amend the Constitution to provide an independent redistricting commission in 10 years' time. So I guess redistricting...
That's not insignificant. Some people may look at that and say, oh, they just kind of pushed it ahead 10 years from now. They didn't do it this year. 10 years from now it'll happen. Well, in 10 years from now, that's going to be a mighty interesting thing to see.
You're right. Now it has to pass 2 legislative, and there's a little fail-safe provision they put in the legislation to amend the Constitution, because it has to be passed in 2 separate legislative terms. So we pass this year, it'll have to be passed next year also for it in order to go to the voters to amend the Constitution. So we'll see how that goes. But you're right, it is no small consequence. Frankly, my district changed substantially under this proposal that was controlled by the legislative leaders. I lose a lot of Onondaga County, which before I had kind of the western half of Onondaga County, all the way down to Skaneateles, but now I only hold on to the town of Lysander and Onondaga, pick up almost all of Oswego County except for 3 towns to the west, and then I go into Jefferson County and pick up the town of Ellisburg. So my district probably changed from a population basis, probably changed by over 50%, although Oswego County is where I live, so it's not a real shock, you know, people know me there hopefully in the county and know what the work I've been doing down here in Albany. So it was, I mean, that just redistricting on a whole is, you know, pretty momentous, you know, and the fact that we're going to push it off to an independent commission, I think, is a good thing in 10 years. I wish we could have done it this year, but
that's just
such luck.
And I know the people wish it had happened 10 years before and 10 years before that. The legislature has always been charged with the drawing of those lines, and it is without, you know, forget all the budget discussions we've had in the past on this program. Redistricting is the most political process of them all.
It is, because it can obviously affect the balance of power here in Albany. So
who's in the majority? Who's in the minority? And there's a lot of power to be wielded.
Yep.
Other issues that came up in that session: pension reform, hugely controversial. You've got the governor advocating a change in the pension systems for public employees, state and local, school districts, teachers. You've got the public employees unions saying, "Oh no, we don't think that's a good idea." Huge political power struggle here at the state capitol. The governor got it done.
Yeah, I have to hand it to the governor, along with some of my colleagues in the legislature, to be able to get this done. It is, as you know, last year we did some pension reform, and to do it 2 years in a row really shows that, you know, the governor is standing up against some very entrenched interest here in Albany that were opposed to doing any additional pension reform. You know, my take on, I've had people in my office, I have town board members in my office complaining, saying that they're having to lay off people because they can't afford these pension costs that have gone through the roof. I thought it was a good compromise. I didn't think, you know, it was so onerous what the governor was asking for. This is all for new employees. This isn't for current state employees. This is anyone coming new into the system. It's essentially modifying the defined benefit part of the pension plan. There were earlier on some claims that we're going to do a defined contribution plan, like a 401k plan, but that almost entirely got knocked out of this reform. There is a little bit for employees that are non-labor employees making over $75,000. We'll have the option to go into a defined contribution 401k type plan. But otherwise, the other things are really defined benefit plan modifications to it, you know, continuing to contribute throughout your career in state government. I think they moved back the retirement age by 1 year. So those were the types of changes, which aren't really, I mean, every change is obviously tougher for employees, but this wasn't drastic as I saw it, and it'll be huge savings to localities. And hopefully they won't be stuck in a situation where they got to lay off somebody. Instead, we'll be able to retain the jobs, especially at the local level, school and localities, municipalities, and be able to afford the pensions too.
Another one of those bills that came up for discussion, and this had been around a few years here at the state capitol, and it's one of those unusual bills in that you could talk to most legislators about it, and you'd seem to get the sense that they were all in favor of it.
Right.
That was the expansion of the DNA data bank, so that more people that are arrested will now be required to give DNA samples, more information into the system. The idea being twofold, that you'd be able to solve more crimes because you've got more information, but you'd also be able to say, you know, oh, so-and-so didn't commit
somebody.
that crime.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what I liked about it. I mean, we've done fingerprints in law enforcement for over a century probably, and that has been an effective way to fight crime, but also to find innocence. Why not take this one step farther where you have DNA, which is even better types of crime-solving, you know, mechanism.
We all see it on TV
past,
every week, the
yeah.
CSI shows and all that, right?
So essentially what we did is expand it to all crimes for DNA, other than certain misdemeanors outside of the penal law. Like I don't think you would have to give a DNA sample for speeding or, you know, even a DWI. Those are outside the penal law, but all misdemeanors and felonies within the penal law, and then some misdemeanors outside the penal law. So it's I think a great bill. I think you're right. It's going to do a lot for exonerating people or, you know, proving them innocent before they're convicted of a crime. And of course, it's going to catch the people that commit the crimes. And I think that's the whole goal of law enforcement. They're very strict procedures in place so that can't be misused. The government can't use your DNA to figure out your health problems or anything like that. Very strict procedures in place. So I think it's a great bill. We've had great success with DNA database in the past. Why not expand it so we can catch some of these criminals and also find out who's innocent?
Yeah, you got to embrace the technology.
Yeah,
you know, you
absolutely.
really do. And I think a lot of the people that watch all those shows, the police dramas that are on now, and especially those CSI type shows, are probably saying, we're not doing that in New York.
Right, probably assumed to some degree, yeah.
Yeah.
It's already being done. Yeah.
One last thing to talk about, and that is teacher evaluations. You pick up the New York Daily News or the New York Post, you read a lot about it in the metropolitan areas, and it's true in Buffalo and other parts of the state. Is this an issue that has been a problem for, you know, more rural areas like where you represent?
Well, it is. I mean, the teachers' evaluations are very tough because the negotiations going on between the state ed department and the teachers' union have been terrible. They've been at a standstill. I personally feel that we should have some sort of teacher evaluation. It's good to judge, you know, how teachers are doing, and if they're a problem teacher not doing well, they ought to be moved on to something else. If they're a great teacher, they should be rewarded for being a great teacher, which I think majority of the teachers are. Hopefully this legislation will move towards that, but there's been just a ton of confusion, Mike, on it, particularly coming out of the state ed department. It seems like they're changing the process constantly, so it's been very difficult for school districts and teachers to agree on what the exact form of the teacher evaluation is going to be. But my hope is this legislation is going to push it forward, get both sides so they can get agreement on this and get a teacher evaluation process in place.
It was an odd debate because a lot of the members that you expected that were going to embrace this and love it, the fact that it was there, said this is not the bill we were hoping for. And like you said, there seemed to be a fair amount of confusion. Maybe this is something that the legislature and the governor are going to need to revisit. I don't know.
Very possibly. We'll see how this thing goes forward, but I'm hearing a lot from school districts that they're concerned about how this thing's going to be implemented and the timeline they have to implement it within. Now, if we don't do a teacher evaluation, the big concern is we lose a lot of federal money, which was part of that race at the top money. So that was another reason I think we have to move this process forward. It was a substantial amount of money, 160 million or something. So
I heard 700
million
for that race to the top, the federal money.
Right.
There go those dollar
700,
signs.
160. Yeah. I mean, we can keep track of it. But
There go those dollar signs again, just like in the cartoons. Will Barclay, thanks for joining us. We are out of time. I want to let the folks watching know how they can contact their representative. Easy thing for you to do to get a hold of Will Barclay. Right there is the address of the office in Fulton. Call 598-5185. Or drop an email at the address you see right there on the bottom of the screen. And as we thank Will Barclay for joining us, we thank you folks too. And we'll hope to see you soon for our next edition, when we should have a budget in place and we can talk about how those dollar signs all played out. And that'll be our next edition of Assembly Calendar.